Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to see each of you here tonight. And I'd just like to say something before we get started in our presentation tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about some of the corruption that's happening to our food supply. And I know that the information can maybe seem a little bit discouraging and depressing, but I would like you to take the attitude that this is knowledge that's going to empower you to make better choices which will have a positive impact on your health. So I'd like you to look at the information from that side of it as we present the topics that we'll be talking about tonight, instead of from the negative side of it, that it's very overwhelming and discouraging and depressing. So to start with, what if someone were to tell you that a chemical added to food could cause brain damage in your children, and that this chemical could affect how your children's nervous systems formed during development, so that in later years they may have learning or emotional difficulties? What if there was scientific evidence that these chemicals could damage a critical part of the brain known to control hormones, so that later in life your child might have endocrine problems? Suppose evidence was presented to you strongly suggesting that the artificial sweetener in your diet soft drink may cause brain tumors to develop and could cause the same brain lesions as MSG. What if it could be demonstrated that all these types of chemicals could possibly aggravate or even precipitate many of the neurodegenerative brain diseases such as Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, ALS, and Alzheimer's disease? Would you be upset to learn that these additives have no other purpose than to enhance the taste of food and simply to boost sales? Tonight we're going to be talking, first of all, in our presentation about excitotoxins. How many of you have heard about excitotoxins? Okay, a couple of you have. Excitotoxins are something that have just in the very recent past here become made more aware, and that's due in part largely to Dr. Russell Blaylock. And I'll also be quoting from Dr. George Schwartz and Dr. John Olney, and they have all done research into the topic of excitotoxins. And Dr. Russell Blaylock has put out a very interesting book, which I highly recommend, and it's called Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills. It's a very excellent book to read to give you information on the subject of excitotoxins. But let's start tonight by defining what excitotoxins are. So here's a definition. Excitotoxins simply are amino acids which in excess cause neurons, which are nerve cells, to fire repeatedly, causing cell damage or death within 1 to 3 hours, and hence the term excitotoxin. Now we're going to break this down a little bit because maybe this is not real understandable as a definition first off. So let's look at a definition of amino acids, because excitotoxins are amino acids in excess. Amino acids are basically the chemical building blocks that your body uses to build proteins. And proteins, of course, are used in the body for a variety of functions. Some form part of the membrane of the cell itself. Others may be used to form enzymes, hormones, and components of various tissues. So proteins are used throughout our bodies. And amino acids are simply the little building blocks. Proteins can be very simple, or they can be thousands of amino acids in size. It's simply, another way of looking at it is kind of like the letters of the alphabet. We have letters in the alphabet that we can pull together and form words. And your body will pull together amino acids to form proteins, the same type of thing. So let's go back to our definition of excitotoxins. Excitotoxins are these little building blocks of proteins, but it's in excess, and that's the part that I want you to remember. The amino acids themselves are not the problem. The problem is the excess of these amino acids. And what these excess amino acids cause to happen, we will see as we go through our presentation tonight. And this will cause something, cell damage or death within 1 to 3 hours. So it's an excitotoxin. Okay? Now the the key ones that I want to mention tonight, there's over 70 identified excitotoxins, but these would be the key ones. Glutamate and aspartate would be the two that you would probably be most familiar with. Glutamate, of course, in the form of MSG, and aspartate, of course, in the form of aspartame NutraSweet. Those would be more the forms that you would be familiar with them. And cystoic acid we'll talk about as well. So those three. You can remember those three names. They will come up a little bit later in our presentation. So excitotoxins are causing cell damage or death within our brains within 1 to 3 hours. It's a very short time that this damage is occurring. And it's occurring in the areas where we have learning, cognitive thought, reason, memory. It's the higher centers of the brain where the damage is occurring. And to me, when I first learned that, I found that very disturbing. And I hope you find it disturbing too, and that it will prompt you to make healthier choices in your food. Okay, glutamate. Glutamate is an important neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter allows neurons to communicate between each other. And glutamate is responsible for opening a calcium channel in the neuron so that calcium can move into the cell. The result is a number of important chemical reactions which stimulate connected neurons. One of the products of these chemical reactions results in the production of free radicals, one in particular, hydroxyl, which left unchecked can kill brain cells. Fortunately, the free radicals are absorbed by antioxidant vitamins such as C, E, and beta-carotene. So in our normal day-to-day living, there will be the production of these toxic free radicals within our bodies, but thankfully, I believe God has a system in place which can offset that toxic byproduct. However, if glutamate levels become even slightly excessive, the calcium channels in some cells get stuck open, and that leads to destruction of those cells and the adjacent cells. And that's where the problem lies. Dr. Russell Blaylock has this to say: virtually all of the neurodegenerative diseases are now considered to be intimately related to the excitotoxic process. Seizures, headaches, strokes, brain injury, and developmental brain disorders are all intimately related to excitotoxins. I found that really disturbing when I heard that. Isn't that incredible? All of these neurodegenerative diseases that are so common and prevalent in our society today, he is stating, and Dr. Russell Blaylock, by the way, is a neurosurgeon, and he is stating this from his own experience and research, that these are basically all intimately related to the excitotoxic process. Now, why would these excitotoxins be in the foods that we consume anyway? How do they get in there? Why would manufacturers want to put them in there if it's going to cause such a problem in our bodies? Well, basically this: because these particular amino acids are stimulating, they cause the brain to have an enhanced sense of taste. We don't actually taste with our mouths, although that's where it appears that we taste. Our taste buds simply transmit a chemical signal to our brain, and our brain then interprets that signal. So our brain is actually telling us if something tastes good or not. And what is happening is these excitotoxins are causing our brain, tricking our brain to think that foods that normally would not taste good, would not be appealing to us, these are now suddenly very appealing. And excitotoxins, these excess amino acids, are often placed in foods such as diet foods. Diet foods, once they take out the sugar or the fat, they can be very bland tasting foods. And so they will put these amino acids in order to stimulate the brain's sense of taste. And therefore, the body thinks that this is something that tastes good, we think it tastes good, and we will continue to eat it. Haven't you ever wondered about some of these diet foods? You can eat a whole chocolate cake and it only has 2 calories. Doesn't it make you wonder? There's something wrong with that. Something in the manufacturing process is wrong. Now here's a list of persons who should avoid excess free glutamate. So if you find yourself on this list, you should be avoiding excess free glutamate. Infants and children, pregnant women, if you have hypoglycemia, that's low blood sugar, if you have low brain energy or brain fog, obesity, mood or psychological disorders, learning disabilities, seizures, headaches or migraines, immune system related disorders, vitamin or mineral deficiencies, if you're a woman of childbearing age, if you have hormone or endocrine gland related disorders, asthma or allergies, tinnitus, that's ringing in the ears, disease of the brain such as Alzheimer's disease, most other chronic diseases, or if you're just a health conscious person. If you found yourself on that list, you should avoid excess free glutamate. It's something you want to stay away from. Now I'd like to give you a list of additives that contain MSG. These additives on this first list here always contain MSG. Now you may not have time to jot them all down, so if you don't, the DVDs will be available to you later. They will be producing these. I'm not sure how long it's going to take to produce them, but you can get the DVD and get the information from the DVD if you don't get it all down. But monosodium glutamate, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, actually anything hydrolyzed or autolyzed, if you see that on a list of ingredients, you do not want to consume it. And in a moment, I'm just going to explain to you the process of how they hydrolyze vegetable protein. So hydrolyzed vegetable protein or hydrolyzed plant protein, all of those. They sound harmless, but they always contain MSG. If it says plant protein extract, that's another one that you will want to avoid. Sodium caseinate or calcium caseinate, often found in firm tofu, for those of you that may eat tofu. Yeast extract. Yeast extract would be the #1 ingredient on Marmite, if you're a person that uses Marmite for your seasoning. Textured protein. Rudy will be sharing with you a little bit later here. Textured vegetable protein, the actual process of how that is made. Autolyzed yeast and hydrolyzed oat flour. Any of those ingredients, if you find them on labels, you want to avoid consuming that. I want you to think, too, that this is not something that's causing damage 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road. This is happening to your brain cells within 1 to 3 hours of ingesting this substance into your body. That is rapid. Now, you might think, well, it shouldn't really be a problem if a few little brain cells die. You know, what's the big deal? And you know what? It wouldn't be something that would be noticeable for one time or a couple of times. But I want you to think about this. When brain cells die, that is essentially what happens when you receive a concussion. How many of you have heard of Muhammad Ali? Maybe you've seen him on TV. Have you noticed something about him when they're interviewing him? Very slow. He's very slow in speaking. He has a hard time forming his words and his thoughts. There's a lot of difficulty there. And that's because he is what's called punch drunk. He's been hit in the head so many times, having received so many concussions, that it's actually noticeable. They call that punch drunk. And this is actually the process that happens over a course of time of ingesting excitotoxins into your body. You may not notice it over the course of a year or even 2 years. But as you continue to ingest on a regular basis, it's like receiving a little concussion every day of your life. And eventually that will become noticeable because, as I said, it's affecting the higher centers of the brain. It's affecting memory. It's affecting our learning processes, our ability to concentrate. So to me, that's very, very significant. Now, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, here's the actual process of how this is made. It's also referred to as vegetable protein or just simply plant protein. If you see that on a label, don't consume it. It sounds harmless, but it's not harmless. It's made from junk vegetables, which are unfit for sale, and especially selected so as to have naturally high contents of glutamate. Remember, the manufacturer wants you to have an enhanced sense of taste. so that you will enjoy eating this food and you will continue to eat this food, okay? The extraction process of hydrolysis involves boiling these vegetables in a vat of acid. This is followed by a process of neutralization with caustic soda. The resulting product is a brown sludge that collects on the top. This is scraped off and allowed to dry. The end product is a brown powder that is high in 3 known excitotoxins, and we heard these earlier: glutamate, aspartate, and cystic acid, which converts in the body to cysteine. These are 3 of the most potent excitotoxins, and this is found in, this is essentially what hydrolyzed vegetable protein or plant protein is, if you see that on a label. So especially check things like soup mixes, flavorings, things like that. Those are usually where you're going to find these high amounts of excitotoxic additives. Now here's additives that frequently contain MSG. Malt extract or malt flavoring, bouillon, if it just says bouillon, if it just says broth or stock on the ingredient list, or flavoring. Oftentimes it just simply says flavoring. That's something you want to avoid. Natural flavoring. Natural flavoring sounds so harmless. It's natural flavoring. And yet it contains anywhere from 20 to 60% MSG. Isn't that incredible? 20 to 60% MSG. Natural beef or chicken flavoring, or if it just says seasoning or just spices. Those are additives that you will want to avoid. Now, commonly when you go to eat Chinese food, they will have MSG in their foods. You can ask them to prepare the food without MSG. And you should actually always check when you go into a restaurant to eat food if they are using any MSG in their food, because that is a common additive that is used in the foods. These are additives now that may contain MSG or other excitotoxins. Carrageenan, also some people pronounce it carrageenan. Carrageenan is, it comes from a red moss, like a moss, and it's used in a number of things. Soy milk is a very common place to find this additive. You want to check your ingredient list if you're consuming soy milk. Another place that you will find carrageenan is the #1 ingredient in EAMS gelatin, E-M-E-S gelatin. If you use that gelatin, which was typically promoted as a vegan gelatin, that gelatin actually is, the main part of it is carrageenan, and that is an excitotoxin. If it just says enzymes on the label, now I don't want you to confuse this with enzymes that you would go into a health food store to purchase. So if you went to the health food store and purchased, say, digestive enzymes, that's completely different. But if you're looking at a food product and you're reading the label and you're reading those ingredients on the label and it just says enzymes, then that is something you want to be concerned about. Okay, that's the difference there. Soy protein concentrate, soy protein isolate. Now, a lot of people use the seasoning Bragg's in their products, and that has been promoted as a health product. I personally cannot feel comfortable promoting that as a health product. A number of years back, a doctor that we worked with in California had spoken to us about this product. We were using it, and he had stopped using it. He said it was a soy isolate. As soon as I heard that, I stopped using the product. And when we returned to Canada sometime later, I thought I would contact the manufacturer and ask them the question if this was indeed a soy isolate. Unfortunately, they were very unwilling to talk to me about that question. In fact, they were very aggressive in denouncing people who had anything to say that was negative about their product. And so I cannot recommend that product as being safe to use. So if you use Bragg's, I recommend switching to a Tamari that says on the label whole soybean, from whole soybean. If it says from whole soybean, it's not an isolate. okay? So I would recommend switching to that. Whey protein concentrate, again, is something that you would want to avoid. Those are additives that may contain MSG or other excitotoxins. Dr. John Olney had this to say. He says, the amount of MSG in a single bowl of commercially available soup is probably enough to cause blood glutamate levels to rise higher in a human child than levels that predictably cause brain damage in immature animals. Children are very susceptible to the effects of excitotoxins in their developing bodies. And he is saying here that in experiments that were conducted on immature animals, the levels that predictably would cause brain damage, a bowl of soup would cause the level in a human child to rise higher than that level. And to me, if I had young children, I would be concerned about that. This is a quote from a book called Counsels on Diet and Foods. And as a Christian, I believe that Satan is trying to destroy the minds of God's people. And this is what this quote says: Satan is constantly on the alert to bring the race fully under his control. His strongest hold on man is through the appetite, and this he seeks to stimulate in every way possible. And I believe that we really need to be careful about what we are putting in our body. The Bible tells us that our bodies are the temple of God, and we need to guard carefully what goes into our body, and our minds need to be protected from the effects of some of these additives that are in the foods.
We were one of those people that went from a meat-eating diet, we switched over to a vegetarian diet. And of course, what we did was we got all the meat analogs. If anybody doesn't know what they are, that would be like imitation hot dogs, imitation chicken bits, and so on and so forth, all these things. And as I went to the cupboard and I looked at the ingredients, I was shocked. Because I'd sit down and enjoy these things. I could eat a whole can of these things and just enjoy them. And now I understood why it was I was enjoying those things. They were stimulating and destroying my brain at the same time. Now I'm going to show you some things that may be shocking. You can write these things down. Just write down the name. And if you find these names on your current food products, if I was you, it would be in the garbage can in less time than it took to realize what was in there. Because these things are extremely dangerous. And you know, the fall of Adam and Eve was due to appetite. And I think we could fall into the same category. I think the devil knows exactly how to tempt us, get that appetite going. And we try to do the right thing, but we end up in a wrong place trying to do the right thing. So let's just have a look here. TVP, as Jeannie explained, textured vegetable protein. The flour can be dissolved in lye and then treated in an acid bath so that the protein is deposited in finely spun threads, which are then wound on a spool. It is then glued, colored, flavored, and cut into meat-sized chunks. Require manufacturers to list specific flavoring ingredients on food labels. Monosodium glutamate, Jeannie already went through this, MSG, highly dangerous substance. Propylene glycol, does anyone know what that is? Well, antifreeze, right? You know you'll find this in some ice creams? Used to be common in ice cream quite a bit. Makes the ice cream so soft so it's not so rock hard. Well, here's what you're ingesting if you're eating this stuff. Implicated in contact dermatitis, kidney damage, and liver abnormalities. It can inhibit skin cell growth in human tests and can damage cell membranes, causing rashes, dry skin, and surface damage. It may be harmful by inhalation, ingestion, or skin absorption. May cause eye irritation, skin irritation. Exposure can cause gastrointestinal disturbances, nausea, headaches and vomiting, and central nervous system depression. Sounds good so far, doesn't it? I'd want to make sure my ice cream was real soft with that stuff in there, or whatever else they want to put it in. By the way, it works great in car engines. I think that's where they should leave it, you know? A published clinical review showed propylene glycol causes a significant number of reactions and was a prime irritant to the skin, even in low levels of concentration. Prime irritant. Lactose. Have you ever seen this? Okay, lactose. It is present only in the milk of mammals and is subject to a genetic disease called galactosemia. Caramel color. You've seen that. Okay, the World Health Organization said that the use of ammonia compounds in the production of caramel for food was unacceptable. It produced convulsions in test animals. Yet the FDA considers it safe. Blue number 1, blue dye number 1. It causes cancer when ingested and malignant tumors at the site of injection. It has been banned in all the European Commonwealth countries, as well as Austria, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. But it's generally regarded as safe by the FDA. Red dye number 3. Studies on animals have verified that this dye is a carcinogen. This dye may be linked to gene mutation. These things were in the foods I was eating. And I wondered to myself, how much of my brain have I got left? Is there any reasoning facility left? Because I consumed quite a bit. And I used to have a lot of bowel problems, I want to tell you. Used to have, but not anymore. Carrageenan, Jeannie already went over that, has cancer-causing abilities. Disodium inosinate. That's inosinic acid, and it's prepared from meat extract, also from dried sardines. Check your vegetarian foods because you're going to find this in there. It's supposed to be vegetarian, but look, it's animal product derived. Lactic acid. It's produced commercially by fermentation of whey, cornstarch, potatoes, and molasses. It is caustic in concentrated solutions when taken internally or applied to the skin. Caustic means it burns. Now, if we're ingesting this into our bodies, what's it doing to the sensitive lining of the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine? You know, we really ought to think. Just because it tastes good doesn't necessarily mean we should eat it. We should use our brain. You see, I picture it like this. You go to the grocery store. You're trying to do what's right, and you've got a war going on inside your body. Your tongue wants one thing, and now that you have an education, your brain wants something else. So here you are in the grocery store aisle, and you're there where the frozen pizzas are. And the tongue says, oh, they look pretty good, don't they? And the brain says, yes, but I know what's in there. And the tongue might say, but you know, we've been really good for 2 weeks, haven't had a thing. How about a small piece? And the brain should say, if you don't behave yourself, I'm going to take you to a different aisle. Now, do you see what I'm talking about? We know that war, don't we? It's going on inside all of us every single day. And it is a fight. If you think it's easy to overcome appetite, think again. It takes determination, and it takes really putting in the good and doing your best to stay away from that which is not so good. Okay, I've stressed that earlier, and I'll stress it again. Sometimes a person is watching the DVD, just this particular DVD, and this is a help. Don't focus on quitting the bad. Add the good, and add enough that you're full of it. And then you won't require the bad or even desire it as much. Okay, another one here. Potassium chloride. Small intestinal ulcers may occur with oral administration. Large doses ingested can cause gastrointestinal irritation, purging, weakness, and circulatory collapse. Now, don't you want to go out and have a mouthful of these ingredients? Just makes you want to, oh boy. But they are very harmful. So I won't condemn any companies, but I'll educate you so you can go out and make your own choices, okay? Does that sound good? Do you feel thrilled that you've learned about what's in your food now? And when you go home to your closet, you may say, or to your cupboard, you may say, oh, I kind of regret having attended that meeting tonight because I know what I've got to get rid of here. Put it in the garbage. Your body will thank you for it later on. And here's Jeannie with some more information, and this is mind-boggling what you're about to hear.
There's some really good books that I would recommend for you. One in particular that you might want to take when you do your grocery shopping, and it's called A Consumer's Guide to Food Additives. Consumer's Guide to Food Additives. Ruth Winters is the author of that book. And when Rudy and I first discovered all the additives and the harmful ingredients that were contained in foods, we would take this book with us when we went shopping. And it would take us a long time to get our groceries because we would read every label. But you know, eventually you start to become familiar with those things that are harmful, and just one look at it and you know right away. And a good rule of thumb is this: if you can't pronounce the word, chances are it's not going to be good for you. So if you don't know what it is, you don't know what it's going to do, don't eat it because it's probably harmful to your body. But I would recommend take that book with you. Even if it takes you longer to do your groceries initially, that's okay. You'll get used to the labels, you'll get used to those ingredients, and eventually it's going to become quite quick to do your groceries. You won't have to take the book with you. I mean, we only did probably for a couple of weeks, we took the book with us. But it's worth it. It's worth it for your health and for your body. Okay, we're going to talk now about a subject that a lot of people, some people know a little about, some people know more about: genetically modified foods. How many of you are aware of genetically modified foods? Okay, good. Actually, quite a few of you are. That's great. Genetically modified foods. We haven't maybe heard so much about it in this country as they have over in Europe. It's been a big debate over in that country in the end of the 90s over there. And you'll see as we go along, we'll talk a little bit about that. Genetically modified foods. Walk through the aisles of any supermarket. Sit down to eat in just about any restaurant, school cafeteria, workplace lunchroom, hospital, or airplane. Open your cupboards and refrigerator. Look at what's cooking in your oven, microwave, or frying pan, or what's on your fork, your spoon, in your cup, or in your drinking glass. You can't see, smell, taste, or feel the difference. And you can't read about it on food labels or restaurant menus. But you and your family are now part of a vast culinary and biological experiment, dining on an expanding menu of genetically engineered foods. Foods that are unlike any foods consumed in human history. There have never been foods like this in all of human history as what we are consuming now. And at least 70%, and I believe that's a very conservative estimate, of our processed foods contain genetically modified ingredients in them, or derivatives of genetically modified foods. Over 70% contain that. So what is genetic engineering?
And what do you think of genetically modified foods?
Personally, I think the jury is still out on them, and I think there's still areas that need to be further investigated over the long term.
I'm a little bit skeptical of genetically modified foods. I like things natural.
I don't have a huge problem with it, as long as there's no preservatives.
I don't know. I know we sell them at work. That's all I know, right?
I think it's a ripoff. It's not good for us.
I don't know that much about them, but I'd rather see things done naturally rather than through chemical changes. So.
Genetic engineering is basically the practice of altering or disrupting the genetic blueprint, known as DNA, okay, of living organisms, and then patenting these altered genes and selling the resultant gene foods, seeds, or other products for profit. So basically what they're doing is they're taking the blueprint for life, they're making it they're altering that slightly, and then with that altered genetic blueprint, they're putting a patent on it, and then they're selling that for profit. That's basically how it works. Scientists transfer an indeterminate amount of genetic information, or DNA, from one or more organisms across species boundaries into another host organism to create an entirely new genetically engineered organism. So it's going across species boundaries, and that to me is very significant. This is something that has not been done before. This is new science that they're working with, and it's not traditional breeding As we'll see later on, we'll talk a little bit about that. This is actually crossing species boundaries. So now an organism is made up of cells. We're organisms. Every cell contains a nucleus, and within the nucleus is found the DNA of an organism. The DNA is the intelligence center. It's a dynamic storehouse of genetic material. And like the manager of a company, the DNA is sensitive and alert to every nuance of activity and information all around it, absorbing and processing and responding to the needs of the cell all of the time. Most of the structure of DNA is very little understood. And because it's non-coding for protein, which is what DNA does, it codes for protein, it is commonly regarded as junk and ignored. This includes 97% of human DNA. Nobody has a clue what will happen if these junk elements are changed. So basically what happens is in the DNA, it codes for protein. That means it will, there's a section of it and it has a code and it will make a protein from that code. And that protein is then used in our bodies, possibly as a hormone, possibly as a structure, as an enzyme, something like that. But 97% of it in the human DNA is non-coding for protein. That means it doesn't code for protein, and so it's considered junk. Anything that is non-coding for protein is regarded as junk. This is a picture now of the double helix structure of DNA. You may remember that from years gone by in school. And you'll see there in the center portion, that's basically expressing the idea of a gene that's being expressed there. And the gene is what we're talking about now. Scientists will find a gene that produces a certain or codes for a certain protein that they want that certain genetic characteristic, and so they will splice that gene, and that is the gene then that they are going to now insert across species boundaries into another organism. So I'm going to try to make this simple for everyone to understand the process that takes place here. Genetically modified organisms are created by taking genes from organisms such as bacteria, viruses, or animals, and then inserting them into other often unrelated species. Unlike traditional breeding, genetic engineering creates new organisms that would never occur in nature, creating new and unpredictable health and environmental risks. Now, the reason I have the tomato and the fish there is because that is one of the crossing that is done. They will take certain characteristics from the fish and cross that into a tomato. Now I have a question for you. If you significantly change the structure or the blueprint for something, does that change what the structure will be? If the blueprint is changed, is the structure going to be different? Yes, it will be different, won't it? Okay, so they're taking the blueprint of a tomato and they're changing the structure of that blueprint. So no longer can we truly say that is a tomato because it's now a cross between a tomato and a fish. Do you follow me? It's truly not a tomato and it's truly not a fish. So now scientists have created organisms that never would occur in nature. And the part that is disturbing about this technology is this new organism that is created has the ability to carry on and it can mutate and so forth, okay? It's unlike traditional breeding where, say, they would cross something and it would only have a generation and that was it. It could not keep perpetuating. So how do scientists transfer genes into the DNA of another species? We're just going to take a short little pause here right now, and when we come back, we'll answer that question. Okay, so we've been talking about genetic engineering, and we want to answer the question now, how do scientists transfer genes into the DNA of another species? Well, one common method used to insert genes is to blast them into the DNA with a .22 caliber gene gun. Scientists first coat thousands of tiny shards of gold or tungsten with the foreign gene. Then they point it at a dish containing thousands of unsuspecting cells and fire, hoping that at least some of the foreign genes will end up in the right place in at least some of the DNA. And this is, by the way, what the biotech industry refers to as their highly precise method of gene transfer. Isn't that scary? Okay. Now, not only do they have to use this gene gun, they have to have something called a vector or a vehicle, and they use viruses or bacteria because something, once they shoot that at the cell, something has to actually take it inside the cell and start perpetuating that gene that they want to get inside the cell. So they have something called a vector or a vehicle, and they will use viruses or bacteria as the vehicle. Viruses typically get into the DNA of a cell, and that's where they will start to change things, and this is what scientists are trying to do. They also have to have something called a genetic promoter, and a genetic promoter is simply the switch that turns the whole thing on. Because it's one thing to get this new gene inside the DNA, but something is going to have to flip the switch and turn it on so that it will start coding for protein. And very often what they use is something called the cauliflower mosaic virus. It's not from a cauliflower, it simply looks like a cauliflower, that's why it was named that way. It is a virus. And that is typically gene spliced into all of your genetically modified foods that they're modifying. So that's the little switch that turns the whole thing on. And then they have to have something called an antibiotic resistant marker gene, ARM. And what this does is once they get this little gene inside the DNA, and they've taken this gun and they've shot it at this dish containing all of these cells, they have to have a way to figure out which cells have actually been modified and which cells have not. And so what they do is they have this antibiotic resistant gene that's going to go in there, and now they're going to spray or cover the whole thing with antibiotics. The cells that die didn't get the transfer, the cells that survive did. That's kind of scary when you think about it. So now this new and genetically modified cell now has antibiotic resistance within it. I want you to keep that in mind. We'll talk about that as we go. So that's basically the little package that goes into the cell to cause this whole thing to happen. Now, to understand the effect of an additional gene on an organism, it's necessary to know in detail all of the ways that the DNA can change and the purpose of those changes in the life of the organism. So the question is, does science know? That would be the question. Jay Fagan has this to say. He says, genetic engineers can cut and splice genes very precisely in a test tube, but the process of putting those genes into a living organism is extremely imprecise, inaccurate, and uncontrolled. Once a gene is inserted into an organism, it can cause unanticipated side effects. Mutations and side effects can cause genetically engineered foods to contain toxins and allergens and to be reduced in nutritional value. Charlie Connick of Greenpeace had this to say. After years on the market, Monsanto, and Monsanto is one of the largest biotech industries out there, Monsanto reveals that neither the industry or the regulators actually know what genes are in GMOs. Isn't that kind of scary? One of the first early genetic engineering experiments illustrates the perils of attempting to transfer genetic characteristics from one species to another. This happened in the 1980s, and the USDA scientists, they transplanted human genes, and these are genes that were supposedly associated with human growth. They transferred these genes into pigs. The idea was to help make these pigs grow faster, and thus to increase the profitability for farmers. Unfortunately, the outcome of these experiments was not what the USDA scientists expected. In one infamous incident, instead of the super pig they hoped for, The pig that resulted from this gene experiment developed into a deformed creature, one that was excessively hairy, lethargic, riddled with arthritis, apparently impotent, and slightly cross-eyed. And as if that weren't bad enough, the pig could barely stand up, according to reports. We actually have a picture of this pig, and I was hoping to get it into the program and didn't actually get a chance to get it in there, but we do have a picture of this pig, and it was a deformed creature, terrible to look at. And scientists thought that they knew specifically what this gene would do. They removed it, the specific gene associated with human growth, and they felt that it should have simply caused growth within that pig. But obviously the whole process within that, something is happening that scientists are not understanding, the whole process of what is taking place. And it's very imprecise, as has been mentioned, and uncontrolled. Dr. Arpad Pusztai, has anyone heard of him? Okay, one hand went up there. He was actually a very well-respected scientist. He practiced at the Rowan Institute in Scotland. He had over 300 published, peer-reviewed articles in scientific journals. Very well-known, very well-respected scientist. In fact, was considered one of the top scientists that there were. And Dr. Pusztai and his wife, actually, she as well was a senior scientist at the Rowan Institute in Scotland. And their group received a large grant to study the effects of genetically engineered foods, and basically the idea was to study these foods to determine if they were indeed safe. And Dr. Pusztai actually was quite happy to do the research because he did not have a lot of concern about genetically engineered food. And so they began their research. And partway through their research, he came up with some disturbing results that began to really concern him. And to make a long story short, he eventually shared this with the public through interview. And this was made broadcast. And his concerns were very valid. I will show you in a moment what his concerns were. The interesting thing was, instead of the Institute giving him honors for what he had discovered, instead of them recognizing what had been found and applauding the efforts that had been made, he was actually fired from his job, both him and his wife. All of their work was confiscated, their computers were seized, their work was seized, the doors were locked, and he had a gag order placed on him. He was not allowed to even speak about what he had found. And I will share with you what he came up with, the key points of what he discovered. He discovered that there are significant chemical and compositional differences between conventional and genetically engineered food. That means a conventionally grown food and a genetically engineered food, there would be significant differences between those foods, okay? There are significant nutritional variations or protein levels in different batches of the same GE food. That means a genetically engineered potato, different batches of that same genetically engineered potato had significant nutritional variations or protein levels. And this was likely caused by the inherent unpredictability of the gene splicing process itself, because that's very inaccurate and uncontrolled, as we've seen the statements. He also found that there can be damage to the vital organs and immune systems of lab animals fed genetically engineered foods, and in this case he was using potatoes. Now I want to share with you that this damage to the vital organs and the immune systems happened in 10 days. This was not a long process of years. It happened in 10 days. And again, this is very disturbing because it has to make you wonder, as you're consuming this food, what is it doing to your body? What is it doing to your vital organs? What is it doing to your immune system? You need your immune system to be well and healthy, and we can't afford to be consuming things that will damage our immune systems. He also found that there's evidence that the cauliflower mosaic virus, which is gene spliced into almost all genetically engineered foods that we talked about, may be harmful to lab animals and therefore humans. So the actual virus itself, that promoter, that little switch that turns the whole thing on, his concern is that there could be harm coming from that to the human body. Now here are some of the dangers of genetically modified foods. First of all, unpredictable permanent changes in the nature of our foods. These are permanent changes. This is not something that we can recall once it's out the lab doors. Genes from bacteria, viruses, and insects which have never been a part of the human diet are being spliced into our food. These are not things that we were meant to consume, and these are not things that we have ever consumed in human history. Deletion of important food elements. Genetic engineers may intentionally remove or inactivate a substance they consider undesirable in food. This substance may have an unknown but essential quality, such as natural cancer-inhibiting abilities. They're not always trying to turn something on within a cell or within the DNA of that cell. Sometimes they're actually trying to suppress something in there. And this is what one of the concerns is, one of the dangers, that they may unintentionally suppress something that is very needed for our protection. Unanticipated negative ecological impact. A genetically engineered bacterium developed to aid in the production of ethanol produced residues which rendered the land infertile. New corn crops planted on this soil grew 3 inches tall and fell over dead. Many plants naturally produce a variety of compounds that are toxic to humans or alter food quality. Generally, these are present at levels which do not cause problems. Combining plant and animal species in genetic engineering may create new and much higher levels of these toxins. Corn and potatoes engineered to produce toxins that kill insects are now classified by the EPA as pesticides rather than vegetables. So this Christmas, as you have a nice heaping helping of mashed potatoes, you're going to have to wonder if that's actually a vegetable or is it a pesticide? Allergic reactions. Genetic engineering may transfer new and unidentified proteins from one food into another, triggering allergic reactions, and this is happening on a very steady basis right now. Millions of people who are sensitive to allergens will have no way of identifying or protecting themselves from offending foods. And it's been taking place in a number of areas. Horizontal gene transfer. This is quite a disturbing thing. In 2002, a study was conducted which was dubbed the world's first known trial of GM foods on human volunteers. Researchers demonstrated that a relatively large proportion of genetically modified DNA survived the passage through the human digestive system. And I want to pause there for a moment because biotech always tried to reassure the public and say it's not actually going to survive the passage through the digestive system. And that was their response to a lot of the concerns that scientists were proposing. But they found that it did survive the passage through. The GM soy that was present in the burger and the milkshake that was fed to subjects at the beginning of the experiment transferred its herbicide-resistant gene to the bacteria inside their digestive systems. The transfer occurred after only a single meal. That's disturbing. This means that the antibiotic-resistant marker gene could potentially result in new and dangerous antibiotic-resistant diseases. What this is saying simply is these subjects ate one meal containing a milkshake and burger, and the soy, the genetically modified soy that was in those products after that single meal transferred to gut bacteria. And what happened is that antibiotic-resistant marker gene, which is part of the package that goes in there, is now in their bacteria within their gut. And the promoter gene that flips on the switch, it turns that gene on 24/7. That means now that they have within their digestive tract antibiotic resistance to a certain antibiotic that is produced 24/7 in their bodies. And to me, this was very disturbing because we're seeing more and more resistance to antibiotics, and this could be one of the key reasons behind it. RBGH and IGF-1, recombinant bovine growth hormone. When cows are injected with recombinant bovine growth hormone, this is a genetically modified hormone, it results in the increase of IGF-1, that's insulin-like growth factor. Now, humans also have IGF-1. We have IGF-1, and it's chemically identical to that which is found in the cows. IGF-1 is not destroyed by pasteurization, so it remains intact in the milk we drink. So our bodies contain naturally IGF-1, and if we're consuming milk, it's not IGF-1 that the cows produce, it's not destroyed through pasteurization, and so we are consuming that now as well. And here is what the dangers are with drinking milk from cows that have received this genetically modified hormone. You have elevated levels of this hormone are directly related to cancer in humans. White males are 4 times more likely to get prostate cancer, and females are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Breast cancer is on the rise. And there's an increased risk of lung cancer and colon cancer in both. So if you are drinking milk, that is something that you will want to be concerned about. The recombinant bovine growth hormone that's being injected into cattle, into cows. Farming. This is not actually a typo. One of the aims of transgenic animal research has been the production of additional proteins in the milk of mammals, particularly proteins that can be used as pharmaceutical drugs. Goats, cows, and sheep have been modified as highly efficient living pharmaceutical factories, continuously producing drugs in their milk within a new industry called farming. Some of the products of farming may be sold as nutraceuticals, part food, and part drug. So basically what they're trying to have happen now is within the milk of these mammals, they are going to be producing pharmaceutical drugs. That's the goal. That's what they're working on. Other modified hormones. Monsanto may soon seek marketing approval for recombinant porcine somatotropin for injection into pigs to produce leaner pork. Basically, their goal is to control the food supply, and that we will one day, all of us, be consuming genetically modified foods. That is the goal. This is a quote from Dr. Herbert Lay. He's the former FDA commissioner, and he had this to say. He says, "The thing that bugs me is that people think the FDA is protecting them. It isn't. What the FDA is doing and what the public thinks it's doing are as different as night and day." This is the former FDA commissioner that's stating this. Here's some things that you can do. You can buy organic foods as much as possible. Try to support the organic food industry. That industry is working to preserve our food supply. And yes, the foods may be sometimes a little bit more expensive, but the quality is going to be there. And you will not be subjecting yourself to some of these dangers that we've been talking about. Ask your retailer to stock organic and non-GMO foods. Now, this can be quite an interesting experiment. I've tried it. And oftentimes when you talk to them about GMO foods, they'll look at you with a blank stare, or they'll tell you that, no, these tomatoes, they wouldn't be genetically modified because it doesn't say so on the box. And then you have an opportunity to share with them the things that you've learned. You can help your grocer to know that, you know what? In Canada, we don't have to label genetically modified foods. The government doesn't require genetically modified foods to be labeled. And so you can help educate your grocer as to the dangers that are in genetically modified foods, and that helps to spread the word. It helps to make others more aware of the dangers and things that they need to be on the lookout for. You can write to your MP. Often that's something that we don't really think about, but that is something that we can do. We can write to the government, and we can let them know that we want labeling on genetically modified foods. You know, in Europe, genetically modified foods have to be labeled. You can actually look at a label and it will tell you that it contains something that's genetically modified. Now, why is it over there in Europe that they have the labeling and here in North America we don't? It's because they stood up and they did something about it. And I have videos that show individuals, they actually chain themselves to shopping carts. Now, I'm not recommending that we go out and do this, but they actually did a lot of protesting. People got involved. Another video that we have, they show a whole field of a genetically modified substance that was being grown there. And individuals are going in and they're just pulling up all these plants, and the police are standing there watching. There was nothing that the police could do, and they're just pulling up this whole field of genetically modified crop. Now again, I'm not recommending that we go about it this way, but in countries where they have stood up and said, no, we don't want this, then they have had to go and make the changes. Retailers have had, manufacturers have had to make those changes. They've had to put the labeling. Government has had to put the labeling on. We have power as people, as consumers. And if we raise our voices, if we write to the government, if we tell them, listen, we want labeling on genetically modified foods so that we can make the choice. I can make the choice for my own body. You can make the choice for your own body if you want to consume it or not. Another thing is we can get the word out to as many people as possible. We need to share the information so that other people are aware of the dangers that are there. And continue to educate yourself about the foods that you eat. Don't stop after these lectures and say, wow, you know, I learned a lot, and leave it at that. Continue to educate yourself. Get the materials, get the books, and continue reading and studying. Now I want to go through very quickly some ingredients that may be genetically modified. Vegetable oils, so your soy, corn, cottonseed, or canola. The key foods that you need to worry about for genetically modified are potatoes, tomatoes, your corn. Those would be key foods that you would want to be careful of that are genetically modified. Soy, your soy basically, if it does not say that it's organic, it will be genetically modified. So if you buy soy that is not organic, you can be pretty well guaranteed it's genetically modified. So be careful of those particular foods. Margarines, soy flour, soy protein, any of your soy derivatives you have to be careful of. Soy lecithin, textured vegetable protein. Not only could it be a genetically modified ingredient, but as Rudy has shown, as we talked about a little earlier, it's an excitotoxin as well. It's not something on 2 counts, it's something that you don't want to put into your body. Cornmeal, corn syrup, any of your corn derivatives, dextrose, maltodextrin, fructose, citric acid, and lactic acid. Food additives, you want to be careful of those because they could come from genetically modified sources. Enzymes and flavorings, again, they can be genetically modified, but they are also excitotoxins. So there's 2 counts there why you wouldn't want to consume anything that just said straight enzymes or flavorings. Processing agents, the sweetener aspartame, that's an excitotoxin as well. Rennet used to make hard cheeses. Meat, eggs, dairy products from animals that have eaten genetically modified feed. And then dairy products, of course, that have received injections of recombinant bovine growth hormone. So you may find those ingredients in foods such as infant formula, salad dressing, bread, cereal, hamburgers, hot dogs, margarine, mayonnaise, cereal, crackers, cookies, the list goes on. Processed foods. Processed foods are your key areas that you're going to have to look for these derivatives. And of course, if you're buying fresh corn, fresh potatoes, fresh tomatoes, generally you don't buy fresh soybeans, but if you were, those would be your foods that you'd want to be very careful of. Okay, from the book Counsels on Health, we're told that God desires His people to be light bearers to a world lying in midnight darkness. God desires His light bearers to ever keep a high standard before them. By precept and example, they must hold this perfect standard high above Satan's false standard, which, if followed, will lead to misery, degradation, disease, and death for both body and soul. And that's what we really see happening as these foods are being manipulated in a way it's causing damage to both the body and it will to the soul as well. In closing, I just want to share with you, this is what God has to say to His people. He says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth." God's wish for each one of you is that you be in health. And so I encourage you that with this information, that you don't look at it as something that is discouraging, but instead look at it as something that's empowering you to make healthier choices, that you can have that healthy body, and that's God's wish for you. I'm just going to put a screen up. Well, maybe I'm not. I thought it was up there. I was going to put a slide up that showed the books that I would really recommend. Seeds of Deception is a very excellent book written by Jeffrey Smith, Seeds of Deception. And it will talk, he's written this in a very readable format, and he goes through all the whole thing that happened with Dr. Pustai. He goes through a lot of the problems with genetically modified foods and where the whole biotech industry is at. Another one is called Eat Your Genes. Okay, that's a very excellent little book as well to pick up. And there's some websites that you can go to. One website, Seeds of Deception, I believe it's .com, seedsofdeception.com, which is Jeffrey Smith's website. He's got a lot of information on there. And another one that I would recommend is The Campaign, which is called thecampaign.org, thecampaign.org. And that would be some good places for you to do some additional reading on the subjects of genetically modified foods and gather more information. So I hope that's been of help to you. Again, I just encourage you to use that in a positive way and look at it as a positive thing that you can do to have better health. Thank you.